This is Duke University.
So welcome all, and I thank you for coming to the first event of the American Grand Strategy Program for the fall. For the winter. We're going to learn just how much of winter it is tonight and tomorrow morning. But I saved the best for the start of the new term because this speaker is someone we have wanted to have for quite some time. He's so young that we haven't been able to want him for years and years and years because he's just started his career, but it's a remarkable career in a very short window. And there's a special connection because he was friends with President Broadhead back when Dick was serving at the community college that he practiced at before he came to Duke. So Jake Sullivan is one of the leaders of American foreign policy today and also tapped as a future leader for years to come. He graduated from Yale, has a law degree as well, but then served under Secretary Clinton on the policy planning. He was the director of policy planning in the State Department. And then after she left, he moved over to the White House to be the advisor for national security affairs to the Vice President Biden. He also managed to develop a remarkable plan that is coming to fruition possibly this year. And we'll talk about that more in a moment. I'm referring, of course, to your wedding, which is coming in June. But there was one other secret activity that I was involved in that we'll get to talk about as well. But please join me in welcoming Jake Sullivan. So what I thought I would do is begin by asking you to describe a little bit what the policy planning role is. That was Kennan's role. So you are the latest Kennan. Is that how we should understand you?
Or there's basically been a secular decline in quality since the 1940s of policy planning directors, and I'm at the bottom of the heap.
You are the youngest who's ever be
That's
policy
right.
planning, right? Yes.
Yeah. So the policy planning staff at the State Department is really used in whatever way the Secretary of State at the time wants to use it. So it changes from personality to personality of secretaries of state. But the kind of core elements of it are, number one, to take a step back from the day-to-day and look at the medium to long term, to look at trends over the horizon and around the corner, and think about how to position the United States to be able to effectively both deal with those trends and shape them. Basically, that's one element of continuity in the policy planning staff, going all the way back to Kennan, who, as all of you know, is the father of the containment strategy. A second is to help the secretary think about how to articulate the foreign policy of the United States. So the speech writing function is housed in policy planning, and turning what is the great kind of complexity of U.S. foreign policy into understandable, definable core elements is something that the policy planning shop does. And then the third element, which is an interesting one, is helping actually the 70,000 people of the State Department who are spread all around the world at embassies and consulates understand what the secretary's priorities are, and what it is that she's trying to accomplish in her period of time in office is also a very important part of what the policy planning staff does. And you would be surprised how big a task that is, because most of the State Department is filled with people who are career public servants and who watch secretaries come and go and hear buzzwords and terms and phrases and think, what the heck do they mean by that? And the policy planning director and staff work hand in hand with those leaders in the department to try to help explain to all the personnel what it is that this Secretary of State's vision is and where she's trying to take the department.
How would you characterize her vision? What was Secretary Clinton's vision as opposed to President Obama's vision? Or obviously they were in harmony, but were there distinctive Hillary Clinton pieces?
Yeah, there were a few that we put a lot of time into defining and trying to articulate both publicly and inside. And start by saying that I think a hallmark of her tenure was to be very closely lashed up with the president, to work as his chief foreign policy advisor, chief foreign policy implementer, and chief diplomat, and really to see him as the guy who defined what the scope and direction of U.S. foreign policy would be. She has a very healthy respect for the Oval Office that she obviously developed up close and personal.
Right.
So she wasn't trying to strike out on her own with the Hillary Clinton foreign policy over here and the President Obama foreign policy over there. But there were a few things that she really emphasized. One of them was the rebalance to the Asia Pacific. An emphasis on elevating U.S. engagement diplomatically, economically, militarily in what she believes is the most consequential region of the 21st century. And there were particular elements within that, like the opening to Burma, that she invested a lot of time in. So that was one.
We had Kurt Campbell down here to talk about that.
I don't believe anything Kurt Campbell says. No,
he said he had to fight you tooth and nail to get that through.
Get it done, right, exactly. So Kurt and I collaborated with her on an article that she wrote in Foreign Policy magazine in 2011 called America's Pacific Century that laid all of this out. A second sort of major focus of hers was thinking about how you broaden the tool set of diplomacy, how you bring to bear new technologies to be able to advance diplomatic ends, to win the communication space, to help in the development space in an effort she called 21st century statecraft. And then a third area was that she invested heavily in trying to get the State Department as literate with Bloomberg terminals as with foreign affairs. So to really integrate the economic elements of national security and foreign policy with the more traditional political and diplomatic elements. And that sort of found its voice in everything from enhanced efforts at commercial diplomacy overseas to defining and going after, from a diplomatic point of view, some of the barriers that U.S. businesses found in countries ranging from China to Brazil and everywhere in between. So those were three sort of distinctive elements of the Hillary Clinton approach at the State Department. She uses this phrase, smart power. Those are three parts of what ladders up to an overall approach of smart power to balance and integrate all the tools of American power in pursuing diplomacy.
Under that last category, would the expansion of social media, Twitter, and but the State Department use of these tools, does that fall under the third, the Jared Cohen sort of?
So that's the second, the 21st century statecraft and the idea of new tools and technologies. And the State Department came into the 20th century at the beginning of the 21st century, when Colin Powell brought the personal computer to the State Department. I mean, this was revolutionary in the year 2001 or 2002. So the department had
Lenovo computers, weren't they?
a steep learning curve in terms of the use of modern technologies. And by the time the secretary got there, social media, online platforms that allowed for movements to grow quickly and to shape conversations and ultimately shape events in strategically important countries around the world, new applications that could help farmers in Uganda or women in India be able to advance economic development. All of this we were in the midst of this revolution, and the secretary basically said, this is a lever of power for the United States and for American diplomacy. If we don't master it and indeed get ahead of it, then we're always going to be coming up short. So she invested pretty heavily in that, despite her own admission that before she arrived at the State Department, she didn't even really know what Twitter was. So this was not somebody who had a long history in technology, but rather someone who saw the opportunity and the need to focus on this when she came on board at State.
So some critics have argued that it doesn't have the gravitas of the State Department to engage in Twitter sniping and counter-sniping and things. Is that a risk? Do you think that there's any downside to the State Department's official embrace of those media?
It's interesting. Maybe broaden out the conversation a bit, because this is something that I think she had to grapple with a lot as Secretary of State. This idea that there's this thing called real foreign policy, which is dealing with China and Russia Iran, and then there's all this other stuff, this women's stuff, and this development stuff, and this technology stuff, and this economic statecraft stuff. And what is that? And I think the argument that she made passionately, and I believe proved out in practice, is that the future of American power and the future of American leadership rests in mastering all of those elements as well as getting Russia, China, and Iran right. So I took over at policy planning while the crowds were massing in Tahrir Square in January of 2011. And for the previous 2 years, she'd been fighting with reporters over whether things like civil society, technology, and development really counted as foreign policy. And there you see one of the most consequential geopolitical events of our time unfolding on the power of technology, civil society, the demand for economic development, responsive government, and the like. And increasingly, threats to the United States and opportunities for American business and for the promotion of American values around the world are going to be bound up in this set of issues that sort of hidebound traditionalists say is the province of someone else. It's not real foreign policy. And what I think the Secretary believed passionately, and what I think history will vindicate her on, is that bringing those to the center of American foreign policy as core tools of American power is going to be a defining feature of our success in continuing to sustain American leadership going forward.
That would suggest then that the events of yesterday, when ISIL hacked the CENTCOM's Twitter feed, that matters more than one might otherwise think, that this is a bigger deal that they were able to do that.
Well, when you think about, in general, the information space and groups like ISIS contesting it in very aggressive ways, trying to bring more adherents to their side, solving for the problem of geography and distance by reaching out directly to disaffected people an ocean away and urging them to go attack their fellow citizens, making a case about a whole people's subjugation, all these kinds of narratives and arguments that ISIS is bringing forward ultimately to pursue their barbaric agenda. If we are not nimble and effective in countering that and in defending our own systems and capacities against cyber attacks, whether it's from North Korea or ISIS or anybody else, then we're going to be at a disadvantage going forward. So a big part of the Cold War was about winning the argument. And we had everything from Voice of America to ambassadors for freedom, that we sent out and around the world, to ping-pong diplomacy. We had all these methods that were celebrated at the time as being a crucial part of that George Kennan containment strategy and a strategy of ultimately winning hearts and minds around the world. And having whole generations of people grow up and look at the United States as an incredibly attractive force. We have to renew that. We need new reservoirs of support for American values and ideas. And to do that effectively, we got to figure out Twitter and Facebook and all the new things that I don't even know about, because even though I'm 38, I'm like...
Yik yak, that's the new...
I'm like 88 in technology year terms, so yeah.
So back to Secretary Clinton, it was a team of rivals. That's how it was advertised, the cabinet. Were you on her campaign staff as well, weren't you? So you were in the Clinton team. Was there friction between the Clinton team and the Obama team, particularly in foreign policy, where she had made a pretty sharp critique of the president in the campaign?
So one of the fortunate events in the summer of 2008, after she dropped out, is that I had the opportunity to join then Senator Obama's campaign to do debate preparation for the general election debates. And in that context, I got to know Dennis McDonough and Ben Rhodes, Susan Rice, the kind of core, and Tom Donilon, the core national security team around President Obama, and spent the summer and fall with them in this intense experience of getting the president ready for his debates against Senator McCain. So I actually, by the time Secretary Clinton was selected as Secretary of State and all these stories came out about rifts and drama between the Obama camp and the Clinton camp, that was sort of a foreign concept to me. But it is definitely true that there was a significant degree of uncertainty among some supporters of each side about how this was going to work. And President Obama and Secretary Clinton knew that they had to set the tone from the top so that they didn't encourage the kind of sniping or mistrust or sort of gamesmanship that might otherwise unfold. So the two of them laid down the law from the outset about the need for everybody to pull together as one team in support of the president's agenda. And the fact that I had relationships and other senior people on the Clinton side had good relationships with people on the Obama side, I think really helped that. And you saw very quickly the way in which we felt as a team seamlessly integrated into the Obama apparatus.
So as we look ahead to 2016, if she does run, and she hasn't made that decision yet, if she does run, do you think she'll be under pressure to distance herself from President Obama or to hug him more closely? I mean, what is the dynamic that she would, what are the pressures that she would face if she did choose to run on the national security side of things?
So without obviously commenting specifically on the 2016 question, I would say that two things about Secretary Clinton as it relates to President Obama. The first is that she's incredibly proud of her record and their joint efforts together on a number of the key issues facing the country. And she will defend those accomplishments. Management of the relationship with China and the Asia rebalance, the building of the Iran sanctions architecture, and several other agenda items. So in that sense, as she has been in the last 2 years, she will in the years ahead be someone who articulates and advocates for the sorts of policies and strategies the president was pursuing. But number two, anyone who ends up running for president, Republican or Democrat, is ultimately going to have to talk about the next 10 years and the next 50 years. And by necessity, that's going to mean going to places that haven't, this president just hasn't had the opportunity to go because he's governing in the here and now. But a vision for the next turn of the crank in American foreign policy and answering the fundamental question about what it's going to take to secure and sustain America's global leadership in the 21st century in a different world than the one that we occupied in the 20th century. Anyone who is thinking about further office or just winning the debate is going to have an answer to that question.
And so I'm inferring from what you said that the press is making too much of a deal then of the few times this past year when she seemed to be making a veiled critique of the administration, like "don't do stupid stuff" is not a good slogan, or even the Syria, where she seemed to, in the summer, indicate that she thought we should have intervened sooner in Syria to have more leverage or something, that the press is making too big a deal of that.
I think the press is doing its job, which is to try to find stories, and a good story would be, rift between Secretary of State and President, or rift between Secretary of Defense and President, and that is a story they have looked for in various places over the course of the last year or so. But I think Secretary Clinton's book is a good reflection, a careful, sort of comprehensive reflection of the way that she looks at her partnership with President Obama, which includes extensive descriptions of where they were like-minded and also candid descriptions of where they had disagreements.
Mm-hmm. We'll get maybe into the policy substance in a second, but I want to move on in your career. She moves on in 2013, and you move over down the street to work for Vice President Biden as his national security advisor. A good friend of our programs is Colin Call, who had a memorable first day of advising the Biden What was it like to advise Biden? Explain what the national security advisor to Biden is like. We had Steve Hadley here describe that to the president. What did you do as national security advisor to the vice president?
So I wore three hats in the role of national security advisor to Biden. The first was obviously helping him think through the ways in which he wanted to make an impact on the foreign policy and the administration. Obviously, he took his direction from the boss. He would remind everybody that there were 4 letters in front of his name, vice president. But where could he apply his unique strengths to advance the ball on U.S. foreign policy? And we spent a lot of time thinking about that question and then executing on it. The second hat was as advisor and briefer and preparer of the vice president for both his meetings and phone calls with foreign officials, his trips, and for the major decision-making meetings in the Situation Room where he would be asked for his perspective on the big question of the day so that the president could ultimately make a decision. And then the third was to be part of a core team with the president. Every morning at around 10 o'clock, we had something called the President's Daily Briefing, which was 30 to 45 minutes in the Oval Office with 6 of us who would work through with the president after he got an intelligence briefing.
Can you say who the 6 were?
So it's the vice president, the chief of staff, the national security advisor, the deputy national security advisor, the
Ben Rhodes, is that the 4th, or was it Tony?
So it was Tony, now Avril Haines,
right.
Lisa Monaco, the counterterrorism and homeland security advisor. So 6 plus me, I guess, so 7 of us, Ben Rhodes and myself. So it was Susan, Tony, Dennis, Lisa, Ben, myself, and then the president and the vice president. And you get an intelligence briefing. The president would get an intelligence briefing from the director of national intelligence or his deputy, and the remainder of the time was spent talking about policy issues, either immediate crises that had to be grappled with that day or larger questions where we'd be reporting on the progress of the interagency and where things stood and getting some early guidance from him on where he wanted us to drive issues. So that meeting every day was a kind of a crucial agenda-setting operation for the work of the national security apparatus of the government.
So to those of us on the outside, Vice President Biden is larger than life. He's a media favorite. What is that the way he is up close? I mean, does he say funny things in private that he says that makes the evening, monologues?
The vice president has a big and kind of amazing personality. Up close as on TV. It's not like he's a different guy when the cameras are off. In fact, if there's one thing about the vice president, it doesn't matter what setting you find him in the Oval Office, in a multilateral meeting in Guatemala, in a tough session, negotiating session with Vladimir Putin, whatever it may be, he is Joe Biden. Mm-hmm. And that he believes is his currency. It's what gives him credibility. It's what enables him to be effective. And it makes him effective. I got to see him kind of work through thorny issues with some complex characters. So he was assigned the responsibility of dealing with Viktor Yanukovych in Yanukovych's last days. And he kept trying to convince Yanukovych that Yanukovych was always going to be a day late and a dollar short in pretty colorful language. And, it wasn't until one of the last conversations where I really believed that the vice president's intervention kept Yanukovych from really opening fire on the Maidan. There had been violence that had killed some protesters, but really large numbers of deaths, I think, were avoided in part because the vice president just kept getting in Yanukovych's face and warning him about the consequences of what would come if the lid came off of the violence there. I got to see him deal with President Rousseff of Brazil around these complicated issues related to Snowden and the allegations from Snowden, and see a different side of the vice president, understanding as a political leader what another political leader has to take into account, and speaking to her not so much as a foreign counterpart, but as a fellow politician. And he's good. He's really good in these contexts and has a unique style that you could not just put someone else in the seat and have them do the same thing.
Good enough to be president? Sorry, that's an unfair question. So your mention of his style, that's a very different style than Secretary Clinton's and very different from President Obama's. In the personal diplomacy, which you've now seen all three of them do, and Kerry, a fourth, you've seen close up. Is there one style that's more effective than the other, or does it matter who's on the other side, that for Yanukovych you need that kind of coarseness, and for, I don't know, you would need a different type hand? What's your assessment of that?
I think I've really struggled with this because it is difficult for me to tell in the moment, in the room, whether that interaction is really the crucial thing or the 1,000 interests that each nation has that's shaping the decision is really what's driving it. So how much does personal diplomacy actually end up being the difference maker? And I've seen circumstances where I think it really has ended up making a big difference, but a lot of cases where it's more about all of the maneuvering that took place in the run-up to that meeting that would yield the outcome. And I think Secretary Clinton was very good at seeing the combination of those two things, what it takes to prepare the meeting and then how to actually carry the meeting out. But she was also very capable of driving a hard bargain when the moment required. When we took the blind dissident, Chun Guangcheng, into the embassy in Beijing, and then upon agreement with him and with the Chinese, he was moved to the hospital, and then he changed his mind and wanted to leave the country. The Chinese basically said, go jump in a lake. We've done one thing for you, we're not doing another, i.e. let him out of the country. And Secretary Clinton basically looked the senior Chinese foreign policy official in the eye and said, the U.S.-China relationship is going to take a severe blow if we do not work this out. This is sort of no BS time. She may have said the words, I'm not sure, I'm just saying BS. We've got to get this done. And you could actually sort of visibly see, I think the Chinese didn't have a full appreciation for the way this was playing back in the United States. And the secretary at one point pulled out an article to show to them showing that Chun had actually called into a congressional hearing on the cell phone in the US and said, you've got to understand what is happening right now in Washington and what the impact will be if you do not figure this out with us. And they ended up coming through. But that was after, and Kurt may have talked about this some while he was down here, she had sent Kurt Campbell and Harold Koh to Beijing to work this so that by the time she has that meeting, it's not just cold, it's set up, it's poised for her to be able to deliver in the end game. And I think that is where truly effective diplomacy comes to bear.
So you've been on both sides of the White House agency divide, and we read in the papers a lot of criticisms of a very centralized White House, David Rothkopf's critique. Some of the cabinet folks who've come through here have echoed it in softer forms. What's your sense? Is there too much centralization? Do we have the balance just right? How would you
so I spent 4 years at the State Department getting asked by reporters, isn't the White House overbearing? They're your overlords issuing directives from on high. And, there'd be days where I'd say, yeah, not to the reporters, but in my mind, I'd say, yeah, of course that must be right. In general, I didn't really feel that way, and I'll come back to that. But my first week on the job, I was sitting in the Situation Room with a group of White House officials.
First week at the White House.
At the White House. First week on the job in the White House, having literally been at the State Department 2 weeks before. And somebody raises an issue with the State Department having, made a mistake or had an oversight. And I literally was like, the damn State Department, and I caught myself and was like, hold on a second. I mean,
Didn't take long to go native.
like 3
right?
days,
Yeah.
3 days. And then I thought, okay, let me put myself back in their shoes and see why it is that worked out the way that it did. I think there are two factors. I believe that in an ideal world, more decentralization makes sense, that you have lead agencies who have contact with the issue at its source, whether it's the State Department and its diplomacy or the Defense Department and the various defense activities it carries out, or the Treasury Department and the international economic institutions. If they were empowered, broad policy direction was sent, and then things were pushed down to agencies, I think that would obviously be a superior approach to everything being funneled up into a centralized scenario. However, I think two factors make that less plausible today than, say, 30 years ago. And there's a reason why there's been a steady centralizing force. One of them is the nature of political accountability. Anything that happens anywhere in the world at any level is ultimately going to land on the president's desk. And it's not plausible to ask a president to just kind of delegate everything, even though the accountability increasingly is going to land on his desk. And the second is that increasingly every agency of the US government is now engaged around the world. There are Department of Agriculture officials and Justice Department officials and even Education Department officials who will pop up in places, in embassies in various corners of the earth. So the State Department no longer is the sole driver of foreign policy. There are all these programs spread across all these agencies with all these personnel reporting up their chains. There has to be a greater degree of interdisciplinarity and therefore coordination at the White House to make this work. You take the Iran sanctions example. You have the State Department doing a substantial amount of the heavy lifting to build the coalition. You have the Treasury Department with the actual expertise on various pieces of it. You have Justice Department legal attachés sitting down and working out compliance issues with foreign governments. And how do you manage for all of that? With different equities in the different agencies, you've got to have some table around which everybody gathers to make this all work, and that is the National Security Council. And as it has to take on more issues, it will naturally grow in size, and you'll see greater centralization. I think it is inevitable given those two facts.
So this brings us to the activity that you're probably most famous for now, but it was not known at the time, and this was the outreach to Iran. I'm not sure what you can tell us about that, but tell us what you can tell us about your outreach to Iran.
So,
particularly during the secret phase.
Right,
yeah.
right. So I was asked to, beginning in the summer of 2012 and then carrying on in 2013 when I moved over to the Vice President's office, to explore the possibility of a channel to have negotiations, private, discreet negotiations off the radar with the Iranians over their nuclear program. So that began with a trip to Oman in the summer of 2012 as a first feeler.
And who's the leader of Iran at this time?
At that time, it was Ahmadinejad.
So still.
Who was president. So this is in 2012. Who is president? Now, who's the leader of Iran, of course, is a bigger, more complicated question. Ultimately, the Ayatollah Khamenei calls the shots, but Ahmadinejad was sitting in the president's chair.
But the public position of the U.S. government was quite the frosty relations.
For obvious reasons. Yeah. I mean, Ahmadinejad was a deeply problematic and indeed offensive character. So it was hard to deal with him on the one hand. On the other hand, the United States had been engaged during the Ahmadinejad presidency in these negotiations with the permanent 5 members of the Security Council, plus Germany, the P5+1 process. So we had established the principle, actually it was the Bush administration who had first established it, and we carried it on, that the US would participate in this multilateral diplomacy with Iran. So it was not a foreign concept that we would be engaged with them. The difference was that we felt to actually make serious progress, it had to be off the books, and it had to be direct between the U.S. and Iran.
So did the P5+1, did your partners know about it? Or?
In the exploratory phase, no. We consulted with them as we got to the point where we felt we had sufficient meeting of the minds, or the outlines of a first step agreement had come together where it could actually be transferred into the 5+1 process, and then from there consummated with the Iranians.
So what did the president see that made him think this was the time was right? What were the indicators that you can tell us that made him think it was?
So there were a couple things. One was the reason that we did this in Oman was the Sultan of Oman had been an honest broker in other circumstances related to the hikers. Some of you will remember the hikers that were taken prisoner and ultimately released in part through the help of the Sultan. And he had indicated that he felt there was the possibility that opening a channel could produce some result, and he had credibility with both sides. The sanctions were starting to bite in a serious way at this point, so we felt that our leverage was starting to reach a relatively strong point. And the problem was not going away. It needed to be resolved, and it wasn't standing still either. The Iranian nuclear program was racing forward, and even though the sanctions were working, each passing month meant a further advance in the program. So the president did feel some sense that now was the time to have some hard-headed negotiations to see if we couldn't produce some kind of resolution to this problem.
So you may not be picked out on the red carpet of the Golden Globes, but surely in the diplomatic corps, they recognize you. How could you do it without them seeing you?
So we traveled.
And did you have to keep it secret from the rest of the U.S. government too, right?
We did. It was a very small circle. We basically took time off in these somewhat mysterious circumstances, and we traveled in unmarked planes and sort of avoided regular airports and operated in, where we did the negotiations themselves was a secluded location, so that for the purposes of this process, we were essentially off the grid.
And what was it like meeting your Iranian counterparts? What can you tell us about who your interlocutors were, and what were they like?
They're
Was it like a Texas standoff, staring at each other?
Actually, at the beginning, there was a fair amount of feeling the other guy out, like circling in a ring kind of thing, which is just the natural human reaction because, look, we have to deal with challenging diplomatic circumstances with a lot of countries, with the Russians, with others, but we've got a history with them. We know these guys. We know both the system and the individuals. With Iran, we've had very little diplomatic contact with them since the revolution in '79. So those early meetings, your learning curve is pretty steep about who they are, how they're approaching it, what's driving them, what it appears that their bottom lines are. So especially in the early meetings, there was a lot of feeling out, and I think they felt the same way from the other side. These guys, the guys that we were negotiating with, are professional, they are tough-minded, and they ultimately answer, just as we do, to their superiors in Tehran. And so part of it is about going back and forth with them, but part of it also is about being effective at laying down messages that they can communicate back home and being sure that there's no misunderstandings about what we can do and what we cannot do.
And so when it must have gone well enough in the secret phase that you advised the president, we can make this more open now, we can bring
So
it
we
out.
got to a point where the president had to make a call, where we said there are the outlines of an agreement, and a first step agreement, not a comprehensive agreement. And we think this agreement can stand up, and we think it's in our interest. And it would mean the next step would be to have the 5+1 take it on board in a public fashion, embrace it, and then basically sign off on it with the Iranians. And in November of 2013, the president decided to do that. We went to Geneva in an effort to close the deal, and on the first go-around, we were not successful. There was a lot of Sturm und Drang and some gaps that remained, and the talks briefly broke down, and we had to schedule a second meeting in Geneva a couple weeks later to actually finally bring the thing to closure.
This is just for the interim agreement to agree to negotiate.
Right.
I should say that the other "we" there is a Duke connection, right? It was a Duke parent.
That's right.
Deputy Secretary Bill Burns.
So Bill Burns, it was Bill Burns and I that were
Did he wear a Duke T-shirt maybe, or to show his loyalty?
I can tell you, he's a big Duke basketball fan. I can tell you that. So
after tonight, you will be too.
Exactly.
So it was you, Bill Burns, and then Wendy Sherman. Did she?
So
join?
Wendy was running the multilateral process, the P5 process.
Right.
Bill and I were doing the secret negotiations. Wendy joined us as the process went along so that we could begin to make that transition from this bilateral channel that we were running to the multilateral process that she was running. And then she sort of took over the process. Bill and I attended that first set of meetings in Geneva, but at that point it was still, the fact of the bilateral channel was still a secret. And so we couldn't go in the front door, literally couldn't go in the front door to the hotel. So we'd come up back stairs and elevators and service entrances so that we could get in the room with the secretary or with Foreign Minister Zarif or others. So that our time in Geneva even was spent kind of sneaking around a bit.
Hiding from our allies.
Not from our allies, they knew, but from our press corps.
Oh, press corps. Uh-huh. Our allies then.
Yeah,
yes, the American people's allies. So we get the interim agreement where both sides agree to talk, but both sides make some concessions. Talk about the concessions that we made and that they made to get the talks launched.
So the fundamental logic of that first agreement was we don't want to create a circumstance where we're talking while they're racing ahead with their program. So we need a circumstance in which their program, the progress of their program is halted, and in some key instances rolled back, and in exchange for that, we'll provide some modest sanctions relief. But the core sanctions architecture will remain in place while we negotiate the final agreement. And to make all of that work, we also needed to have substantially enhanced transparency measures so that we'd have a better window into the Iranian program and know what they were doing and weren't doing. And that included things like daily inspector access at some of their nuclear facilities and new types of access that we hadn't had before to various aspects of their nuclear program, so that we would just have a better sense and the world would have a better sense of what was going on.
And the negotiations continue until they get close to the deadline. And the deadline was artificial, right? You all set that basically to create an action forcing mechanism. Is
For
that right?
two reasons. So it was a 6-month deal, renewable. And the reason that we set 6 months is both because you want to have some pressure on the negotiators, but also because we needed to know, is this working for us? Is having this interim agreement with some modest sanctions relief in exchange for these steps fundamentally in our interest or not? And what we determined after 6 months is yes, it was, and then we extended for 4, and that was to this past November, and now we've just extended again for a few more months and made another gut check. Is it still working for us? And the president concluded, yes, it's still working for us, so let's keep going. But we have consistently given ourselves the opportunity to say, you know what, this is no longer working, and if we're not going to get to an agreement, we're going to have to choose a different path.
So what's the sticking point, though? There can't be an issue that you haven't already talked about many, many times. So everyone's positions must be well known. Why wasn't an agreement reached at the first 6 months or at the November? What can be accomplished in the next couple months that couldn't have been accomplished last year?
So there are two aspects to this. One is this is an incredibly technical agreement, incredibly complicated. There will be literally hundreds, if not 1,000, different small issues that need to be nailed down, because from the perspective of the United States and the P5+1, the devil is in the details. Knowing that you've locked down each of the pathways to get to a nuclear weapon, knowing that you have defined with specificity each of the transparency measures, that requires incredibly intensive, detail-oriented work. So that just takes time. There's that aspect of it. But then you're going to have a fight over every single one of those details. That's in the nature of negotiations. So it's not so much you're just rehearsing big arguments about 2 or 3 issues over and over again. You're going through these issues one by one, then going back to them and seeing how they fit together. And that's the other aspect of this is an integrated whole. So all of the pieces have to work, and where a concession might be given in one space, it has to be offset with something in another space. And others on our team have likened this to being like a Rubik's Cube to get it all to fit together. And we're basically still working at that Rubik's Cube.
And what's to stop Iran from just continuing to talk, while they continue to inch closer, and take the modest sanctions relief? The economy has actually improved a little bit over projections in the last 6 months. So maybe it's more than modest. But in any case, take that and just play us along. How do we know that we're not being played for saps is the question.
Well, that was exactly the question that we asked ourselves when this started. How do you design a negotiation where playing for time isn't just an easy strategy? Right. And the answer was that you clarify on every significant dimension of their program that they have to halt the advance, that they cannot make further progress at their enrichment facility at Natanz, at their underground facility at Fordo, at their plutonium reactor at Arak, or in other aspects of their program. And in fact, as we've gone on and done these extensions, we've clarified certain aspects just to make sure that that basic principle applies. So while the talks are happening, they're not actually adding more centrifuges or finishing their plutonium reactor or taking the next step on centrifuge production. We have created a circumstance where we can talk, but they can't advance. And by the way, they also had to take a significant step. I don't know how many of you guys remember Prime Minister Netanyahu's cartoon bomb, but he held up this drawing of a bomb at the General Assembly a couple of years ago. And he basically said, this is where the Iranians are on this. And what it was a rendering of how much 20% enriched uranium did they have, which got them a substantial ways toward a nuclear weapon. And they were in the 200 to 220 kilograms, and they need about 250 for a nuclear weapon. So we have taken that number from 220 down to 0 as an additional aspect of this to make sure that we're not sort of sitting in an unstable place as these negotiations go on. Then on the sanctions side, we saw the predictions at the outset, which was this is going to open the floodgates and to completely take the lid off, and those simply haven't borne out. And we have also worked hard to continue to enforce the sanctions that are on the books, to bust violators and evaders and basically say, yes, you get this sanctions relief, but everything else is going to be enforced to the full extent of the law. And that's exactly what we've done.
So the president has repeatedly said that no deal is better than a bad deal. But that implies that he could live with no deal. That when the choice comes down, no deal or bad deal, he could live with no deal. But what is the world of no deal like? Is that Iran breakout into crossing the nuclear threshold? Or what does no deal look like? And if you can't answer that, you can tell me you can't answer that. But.
So I can't fully answer that question. I will tell you that the administration spends a lot of time thinking about all of the potential scenarios and has looked at what happens the day after there is a deal, which creates a whole set of circumstances. Iran's going to get a bunch of sanctions relief, and what does that mean? And what happens when there's not a deal? And that kind of scenario planning, by the way, is something policy planning, back to your first question, itself, that's the kind of function that they put time into. But I will say this, as a principle, as a fact, if these negotiations break down, then we have made clear that we are going to move back in a significant way to the pressure track, which means tightening the screws further on sanctions, increasing isolation, because we believe that breakdown will suggest that the Iranians weren't ultimately serious about doing this, and we'll ask the international community to join us.
So would it help you if Congress passed additional sanctions, but that are triggered by the collapse of negotiations, so that would make it clear to Iran that the pressure track is the alternative?
This is a balance of risks question. Passing legislation now creates risks about the cohesions of our sanctions architecture. And the question on the other side is, if they don't, is there some risk that Iran won't understand that more sanctions are coming if this breaks down? I think that risk is incredibly low. Iran understands that Congress, which passed its last sanctions 100-0 in the Senate, and 420 to 20 or 410 to 20 in the House, is not going to have any problem moving very rapidly to passing sanctions. So passing them now at a delicate moment in the negotiations, it's hard to see how that creates significant diplomatic advantages, and it does create some challenges. But that being said, I will say this. I have personally engaged intensively with the Congress, as have others on our team, and I do believe that Congress was in at the takeoff on this Iran policy in a big way. They were crucial to the design and construction of the sanctions architecture, and they're going to have to be in at the landing of this thing, in that we are going to have to remain closely in close consultation with them, make sure they feel comfortable with a deal that we produce at the end of the day, and seek as we go along their advice, because they know a lot about this issue as well.
So I'm going to ask one last question, but we have opportunity for you if you want to ask questions. There's a microphone there, so please get in line if you want to do that. I have two questions. You can pick which one you want, and it's on the Paris tragedy or the North Korean. I want to take you to totally different, the North Korean movie. Which one of those would you like to be asked about? And they'll ask the other one, I'm sure.
Okay. I mean, the Paris tragedy is pretty salient. So.
Right. So if you were advising, so you're in the policy planning shop, when this happens, you wouldn't be responsible for crisis response. You wouldn't be responsible for, does the president go, or you might advise the secretary whether she goes to the march, but you would be on thinking about the day after the day after. But we've been thinking about the day after for 13 years or so, since 9/11. So what else can be done to address this threat that the policy planning shop hasn't already come up with? I mean, it feels like we're doing everything. Is that right? Or
yeah, part of it is
can be done now.
It's less what new, because I think the menu of options has been pretty well vetted through the years of the Bush administration, which had incredibly effective results from a lot of its counterterrorism policies, and the Obama administration, which has also been quite effective. So we know a lot of what needs to be done, but the question is, where does the balance of effort need to lie? And there was a time when complex attacks being planned from safe havens in the Fatah or Yemen was top of mind for the counterterrorism professionals. I would say what Paris underscores, it wasn't the first revelation of this by any stretch. You can go back to the Times Square bombing and other things, but what it underscores is that the nature of the threat is evolving in a way that requires us to pay closer attention to things like the flow of foreign fighters to battle zones, which was a major topic for the Security Council this past September, about homegrown radicalization that's influenced by, as we were talking about before, messages coming in from abroad, and about not so much complex, spectacular attacks, but more limited attacks using more limited means. And that doesn't mean it's going to be a revolution in what the counterterrorism and homeland security people do, but it does point up the fact that we are going to have to adapt even as our enemies are adapting. And I think that is probably what Lisa Monaco and all of the folks working on this are grappling with right now.
So would you have recommended to Secretary Clinton that she go to the march if you had been policy planning?
That's a hard question to answer, but I mean, yes, I probably would have.
Good. Counsel.
Hello, my name is Gautam Hati. I'm a sophomore, and I wanted to ask specifically, you mentioned Secretary Clinton's efforts to integrate technology into the State Department's methods and toolkit. I wanted to ask what sort of specific progress you think has been made on that front, and where you think, what specific achievements have been made due to that particular tool, especially given that in a number of the technology-driven circumstances over the past few years, so things from the Iranian election in 2009 to the Arab Spring, to the message war with ISIS, to homegrown radicalization, there seems to be at least the impression that the administration has been caught on its heels, at least somewhat. The administration more generally and the State Department specifically. So where do you think that that's had an impact, and what progress have you seen on that front?
I'll give 3 examples where I think we've seen progress, although I think there are many. But before I get to the examples, I will basically agree that when you're thinking about innovation and staying ahead of the curve in a space, in a domain that's as rapidly evolving as technology, you wouldn't naturally think of government as the one that's always going to be way out on the leading edge. So
healthcare.com, the website, yeah.
For example, right. Yeah. So it does require beginning with a sense of what are the limitations of bureaucracy, of interagency processes and so forth, and then what's the best we can do given those limitations. But nonetheless, that being said, I think we have made substantial progress. So first, the State Department invested heavily in what are called circumvention technologies for human rights advocates seeking to communicate with one another in countries that essentially censor in the internet. And I think we're somewhere in the neighborhood of $40 to $50 million a year that's being spent on some of these tools, which, whether it's in Belarus or in China or indeed in Iran, we have seen some real results in terms of people being able to communicate with one another in a way that their governments are trying to disrupt. So that's one. A lot of learning about what's worked and what hasn't worked in that, and a constant race to stay ahead, but meaningful efforts invested that have produced some results. The second is that there are a number of effective applications in the development space that the US has been able to disseminate, whether it's mobile banking, that has made it much easier to do things like pay the Afghan National Army, or it's agriculture-related applications that allow farmers to manage crop yields and weather patterns and the like. And those have had a real-world impact in a number of different contexts and are also important. The third is pretty nascent, but it's a start. Secretary Clinton stood up something called the Counterterrorism Strategic Communications Center, which essentially is designed to contest the ideological space vis-a-vis terrorists and violent extremists. It has been chiefly focused pre-ISIS on al-Shabaab. And that effort has produced, I would argue, some notable results in generating, stimulating kind of locally owned opposition to al-Shabaab through the way that it's painted al-Shabaab's tactics and methods and so forth. ISIS is a much bigger fish to fry that requires a different kind of strategy, but it requires building on that platform, which did not exist before Secretary Clinton was at the State Department. Now we actually have the tools, the baseline, in terms of expertise, in terms of technology, to build out a strategy against ISIS, and that's underway as we speak. And I think if you ask Ben Rhodes, who's the Deputy National Security Advisor for Strategic Communications, what keeps you up at night, one of the things he would say is making sure that we're getting better every day in this information campaign against ISIS.
Yep.
Thank you for being here. My name is Jack Dolgen. I'm a freshman. And I was wondering about the way the decisions are made in the White House. So specifically, there's obviously a balance between maintaining secrecy and allowing for a lot of opinions. And I guess I wonder, what does it look like in terms of who is that inner circle, who is informed and making the decisions, and whether you think that is the best way things can be done?
And are you in that inner circle?
Now I'm happily ensconced at the community college up in
New Haven.
Yeah. So there's a systematic process called, the interagency process, which starts at the IPC level, the Interagency Policy Committee level. So that's people at the Assistant Secretary level. They get around the table at the White House, all of the relevant cabinet agencies that have a stake in a given policy, and they hash it out. Then it gets passed up to the deputy level, which is deputy secretaries from all the cabinet agencies. Then it gets passed up to the principals level, which is the secretaries of state, of defense, the director of the CIA, et cetera. And then ultimately to the National Security Council chaired by the president. That process actually is, as far as government goes, you look on the domestic side, whether it's the economic policy or domestic policy, it's far more rigorous and systematic and with clean lines and delineated timetables and so forth than I think virtually any other aspect of government decision making.
The national security side is more than
Yes.
the domestic, yeah.
Right. But that being said, there's obviously the informal dimension to this as well. And that happens at a couple of levels. One is the National Security Advisor will hold a weekly lunch with the Secretary of State and the Secretary of Defense. And in that meeting, the three of them do a lot of business where they kind of shape how they collectively think about the issues that are going through that process I just described, and where they compare notes on events happening in the world. Then you've got the Secretary of State, Secretary of Defense, and Chairman of the Joint Chiefs, who every week get a meeting with the President in the Oval. And again, it's a chance to check signals, maybe once in a blue moon to end run the process to get some approval for something, but very rarely. People, and then you have this daily briefing with the President, where you've got the President's inner circle of advisors being able to really talk to him in a frank way about issues. But I would say that it's not like this other process happens and is ignored and then the president retreats to his inner circle, not by any stretch. These things have a kind of feedback effect to them. So the issue gets fully debated and ventilated and aired out in the National Security Council process and meeting, and everybody gets their say, and everybody weighs in, and it's very transparent. And then the president just likes to have a group of people that he can fundamentally bounce ideas off of. And I would submit to you that's true of not just any president, but any CEO, any leader of any institution is ultimately going to have people that they need to talk to and say, hey, does this make sense? Am I missing something outside of the context of a very formal process? And that happens with this president, but he is fastidious about making sure that the process is respected fundamentally and that everybody's views are heard and accounted for in the course of decision making.
Everyone thinks Valerie Jarrett plays a big role, outsized role, but she's not in the PDB meeting?
No.
Hi, I'm Ali Reza. I'm not from this department. I'm a postdoctoral researcher in mathematics. I'm a citizen of Iran. And how many questions can I ask?
Sorry?
How many questions can I ask you?
Start with one, good one, yeah.
So I start with a tiny one, then I move on. Because the audience is probably not interested. When you started the negotiations in Oman, who was the lead negotiator for Iran? Was it Velayati?
I think the Iranians, I'm not sure the extent to which they've talked about who their lead negotiators were, and I've made it a point to describe what happened on our side but not on theirs, so
Okay.
I'll leave it to them to answer.
Did you
that.
You get one more then with that,
Okay.
since he dodged that one. Yeah.
Okay.
It wasn't dodged so much as refused to answer.
Yes.
And so what is the scenario that you would say after that point you trust Iran on the nuclear program? Because I don't, from what I understand, in 2003, I believe, under President Khatami's government, Iran halted all its program. And still the issues were not resolved after 2 years. We didn't get to the point that you said we trust you. So what is that point? And if that point is reached, how much of the sanctions are you willing to lift? Because, as you know, better than us. Most of the sanctions are not related to, well, I don't know how much, are not related to a nuclear program. They existed before that. So how much are you willing to lift?
So I think we've laid out pretty comprehensively what it is that we believe has to be in a final agreement that would make us feel confident in that agreement. And it's closing off all 4 potential pathways to a nuclear weapon in a verifiable manner over a sustained period of time. And if we are able to do that, then we are prepared to reach an agreement that fully and finally resolves the Iranian nuclear issue. And in that context, we're prepared to give substantial sanctions relief to Iran, comprehensive as it relates to nuclear-related sanctions, and large sections of the US sanctions regime are connected fundamentally to the nuclear issue. So this is something that we have come to and said, we have built up a sanctions architecture in large part because of the nuclear program. If Iran can give confidence to the international community that its program is exclusively peaceful, then we can take that sanctions architecture down over time as confidence is built. And from our perspective, we think that that is the best way to resolve questions that didn't end in 2003, but have continued to this day about the nature of the activities being carried out in the Iranian program.
But a lot of the sanctions are tied to, say, terrorist support for Hezbollah and other terrorist-related activities. Those would presumably still be enforced because they're not on the table when you're talking to Iran now, right? It's just the nuclear issue.
So if you look at the terms of the first step agreement that was reached in Geneva in November of 2013, it specifies that we're talking about nuclear-related sanctions. But this is, so terrorism sanctions, human rights sanctions, those are not at issue in this negotiation. That being said, this is not an effort to have some kind of bait and switch where every last sanction just remains in place under a different name. I mean, we are talking about a circumstance in which those sanctions that were generated and implemented as a result of the nuclear program and to get leverage in the nuclear negotiations, those are the sanctions that are on the table in this negotiation.
So the flip side of his question is, how would the Iran be able to trust us, right? Isn't there's this concern that we have so many objections about the Iranian regime, nuclear weapons just being one of them,
right.
How can they trust us?
So I would basically say that as I was describing earlier, these multitude of issues, specific issues that need to be worked out, and the devil is in the details. That's going to be true with the timing, sequence, and substance of sanctions relief as well. So it won't be a single sentence about sanctions relief. It will be a careful laydown of how and when and under what conditions things happen, and what specifically that is. That's part of the negotiation that's happening right now. At the end of the day, I don't think that, at least from the US perspective, trust should be the driving factor in this negotiation. The driving factor should be verifiability, and it should be a sense that we can get the deal we need to have confidence that those pathways are cut off, and not think so much about, well, do we feel good about where the other side is. We've got to have confidence in the words on the page and how they'll be implemented in practice.
Okay, so we'll have to go to the next one. Thank you.
Evening, my name is Miguel Guevara. I'm a sophomore here at Duke. And so the past few years have been fairly tumultuous on the global stage, particularly for the Obama administration and for a lot of states that are consolidating democracies, or at least in the beginning stages of consolidating democracies. So my question is, based on your experiences working with Secretary Clinton and Vice President Biden, what exactly were the deciding factors for them, at least, or for the Obama administration, to either create or not create action, U.S. action, or changes in U.S. policy for certain issues? For example, like the administration speaking out against Mubarak during the Egyptian revolution, but being relatively silent on the uprising in Bahrain, or being vocal against the pro-Russian government in Ukraine versus being relatively silent as opposed to the military junta in Thailand. What were the deciding factors on an individual level of analysis for your bosses?
You have
on every single one of those. Please.
Right. No. I mean, honestly, you've touched on a major issue for foreign policymakers, not in the Obama administration, but since human rights and values became a central feature of US foreign policy after the Second World War. And you can go through the whole Cold War period and ask why this country this way and that country that way. And what's interesting is that I think we do best when we are more honest about the challenges and trade-offs. That we have a different relationship with Saudi Arabia than we have with China, than we have with Cuba, than we have with Vietnam, and we assign different inputs and values and weights to different aspects of these relationships. And why is that? Now, you can go through each country and give an explanation as to why, but the fundamental reason is because the United States has both interests and values, and they do not always perfectly align, though we work to align them. And over the longer term, they align much more than not, and our SMART strategy is one where we are building up the value side because it's ultimately going to coincide to a greater degree down the road with the interest side. So what happens is, a lot of the time, people will sit in the room and say, well, okay, in the long term, sure, it'd be good to have a stable democracy in all these countries, but in the short term, we need cooperation to do whatever, fight ISIS or basing agreement or you name it. Important things. And so you end up compromising in the short term while planning for a long term that never arrives. Okay, that I think is a good diagnosis of much of US foreign policy over administrations, Republican and Democrat alike. Now, increasingly, we recognize the ferment in other societies and that instability is being generated from within them. So increasingly, we have to grapple with this question. And I don't have actually a textbook answer because this is in the nature of policymaking. It's imperfect choices being made by imperfect people on the basis of very imperfect information about what's happening in these countries. So we have to just try to do our best. But I believe that this has to begin from a position of candor, that we have to recognize, we are treating different situations differently. We are doing so in part because there is some gap at any given moment between our interests and values, and we need to weigh them up as we go. And if you do that, if you have that candor both publicly and privately, I think it helps you generate better decisions in each of these cases going forward. The last thing I will say on this is that I think we do have to ask serious questions about how much impact the application of US influence has on changes in domestic societies in the short run. Cut off aid and we'll get them to do this. Threaten them with sanctions, we'll get them to do that. Sometimes that works, sometimes it doesn't, and I think our debate is oftentimes too unsophisticated about what the opportunities are and what the limitations are, and we should be more honest about that as well. I think over the long term, the US has unbelievable potential to help shape, because it's ultimately up to the people themselves, the futures of these societies, and more consistency and constancy in the application of long-term influence through support for democratic movements, civil society, and the like, is something that should become a more consistent feature of US policy as we go forward.
You sound almost like Condi Rice in transformational diplomacy. That sounded scarily like Condi Rice, yeah. Scary for you, I should say, yeah.
Hi, I'm Brian Groves. I'm a second-year PhD student here at Sanford, an active Army officer, and spent a year at State when you were there as well. Thanks for coming. My question is about the nuclear negotiations with Iran. David Ignatius wrote a piece recently talking about the dynamics, as he saw it, of a double game in which we have leverage because of our demonstrated cyber capability against Iranian nuclear facilities, and in which the Iranian regime has leverage against the United States in terms of its ability to attack US troops in Iraq via its proxies. I would like you to comment on his argument, and what do you make of that?
First of all, thank you for your service. It's a hard question for me to answer. in large part because you sit in the negotiating table and you recognize that there are these forces out there happening around you. For example, in September of 2013, as we were doing these negotiations, the Syria chemical weapons thing had come to a head, right? And there's a question, is the US going to bomb or not bomb? And we're sitting there, we're in the middle of negotiations. ISIS happens, negotiations are ongoing. Afghanistan is unfolding, negotiations are ongoing. So you're the negotiator in the room, you're steeped in this centrifuge and that reactor vessel, and you're aware of the fact that obviously there must be some impact from all of these other things happening and all of these other tools and levers going out there, but what exactly is it? What I would basically say is that the United States has worked very hard to segregate the nuclear issue from these other issues because we don't want to trade, for example, cooperation from Iran and Iraq for some concession on the nuclear file. There are things we need on the nuclear file, period, full stop, no matter what happens with anything else going on. And that's what we need to get. So in that sense, I think there is a slight flaw in the Ignatius argument because these aren't all in a seamless kind of trade-off basket. The nuclear issue does, to a certain extent, sit apart. But beyond that, on the specifics of what he was arguing, I'm just not really in a position to comment.
But in the larger sense, this gets back to the question of what President Obama saw in 2012.
Yeah.
Because what he saw in 2012 may have been a chimera. That is, he saw the U.S. out of Iraq, Iraq stable, the Iranian leverage over us gone because our troops were gone. And so we had leverage over them through sanctions. They had minimal leverage over us, except for the nuclear issue, and we could focus on that. That you could imagine someone thinking that that was the world in 2012. That's not the world in 2015, as David and Brian just explained. So isn't it possible that Iran has much more leverage over us today than they did when you first went to Oman? And so the negotiations are less favorable to us today. The positions are favorable.
I don't believe that the prospect of Iranian cooperation against ISIS is a particularly attractive force for us, such that we'd say, oh, let's try to get a deal so we can get that. I just don't think that there are senior people in the US government that really put a lot of stock in that notion. And therefore, that aspect of leverage I don't really think exists. Mm-hmm. And as far as the leverage on the issue of US troops being back in Iraq, I would say, this president would have a simple message on that issue and would not consider that a kind of a bargaining chip of sorts for the Iranians to play. So from my perspective, neither was the Iraq question particularly top of mind when we looked at the combination of factors that led us to get into this negotiation, nor do I think what is happening with ISIS and Iraq fundamentally change either our basic negotiating positions or strategy or the imperative for Iran to ultimately conclude a deal here. Because what drove them to the negotiating table, I don't think was Iraq. I think it was the nuclear file, and I think it was the sanctions. And so the debate really, I think, is being played out in that space to a much greater degree. Now, there will be enterprising people who argue from the other side, hey, we're happy to help you out on ISIS if you help us out on this. But if they hear no enough times to that, then I think that does end up having an impact.
Okay, we have time for the last two questions. Yeah.
My name is Warren. I'm also active duty, and thank you for coming. I have a general question about the crisis in the Middle East. When you're going from things such as Iraq, Afghanistan, Israel, Benghazi, and you have all these stories that begin to unfold, and then you have members of active duty that go and write books such as No Easy Day, American Sniper, and things of that sort that become open source. With those, it brings concern for national security and how things develop and how the Department of State and the National Security Agency starts to develop new strategies to maintain positive relationships with other nations and how we do things militarily. What are the, basically I'm just asking, what are the strategies and efforts that the NSA and Department of State have to make to maintain those relationships?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, there's been WikiLeaks, Snowden, and what people are prepared to go out and write and say about the inner workings of our relationships with other countries. These things do have an impact. And when I was with Secretary Clinton after WikiLeaks happened, we went to Kazakhstan for this big summit. And it was basically every 20 minutes another foreign leader in the room for her to have to basically say, we regret that these things were leaked about you and the things that were said about you in them. 20 minutes here, 20 minutes, a whole day.
It was an apology tour, was it?
Without, I wouldn't go quite that far, but it was basically saying, you had every reason to expect that private conversations would not be put out in the public domain, and you have every reason to expect that the musings of U.S. government officials about your personal character aren't going to be splashed over the front pages of newspapers. And then the Snowden thing is a whole other issue which required an incredible mustering of diplomatic effort by every aspect of the government all over the world, to the point where, yes, there is a finite amount of time and resources to spend on foreign policy, and when you're using X% of it on that, yeah, it's taking you away from the work of other things, and you're set back because some trust has been lost with core allies like Germany, with emerging partners like Brazil, and with other countries as well. And the other aspect of this that's quite troubling is, in ways that I think are deeply unfair, almost bordering on ridiculous, it gives arguments to bad actors to say, oh, the US is the bad one, not us. And so that set of issues has been a huge challenge for us to contend with. I think it will be a feature of foreign policy going forward. And I think that to a certain extent, we now have to price that into the market as we think about how we manage our relationships, how we build resilience in those relationships so that another batch of revelations or another document doesn't create the same level of furor and the like. And that's something that the administration has put a lot of time into. But foreign policy is about interests, it is about nation states, but it's also about trust and relationships. And Secretary Clinton and Vice President Biden both care deeply about being custodians of relationships as individuals. And their job was made immeasurably more difficult by this set of activities.
Can you hear me? I suspect that that's making an interesting and exhausting effort to find out innovative ways to use media to our advantage and to continue creating positive relationships.
Absolutely. Last question.
Hello, thank you for coming. My question is about the Horn of Africa. I just wanted to ask you, I might take a long time to answer very specifically, but if you could just generally say, what are some of the main objectives and concerns of the administration in the Horn of Africa?
So when we came into office, within the first month on the job, it's February, late January, early February of 2009, we got reports that Mogadishu was within days, if not hours, of falling to al-Shabaab. That's how on the precipice it was. When Secretary Clinton left in beginning of 2013, she had the health issue right there at the end there. If she had not had that, she very likely would have ended up going to Mogadishu as a show of solidarity with the new government. Because in that intervening period, you saw incredible progress with setbacks and complications and so forth by government. And that was a circumstance in which the international community got on one page. where local actors building from the ground up took real ownership of the problem, and where today you still have major problems with al-Shabaab and attacks and all the like, but you have the possibility of Somalia over time building its way towards a stable, functioning state. Still a ways off in the future, but a far cry from where we were in 2009. And I think there are 3 lessons from that. The first is that the international community has to not have 1,000 different plans and programs and everything else. They've got to have one. And it's got to be coordinated carefully with the country, and that's number 2, that you need local ownership for any of this to work. And local ownership from starting with places like Puntland and Somaliland, but then building out into Mogadishu and elsewhere has helped generate real progress there. And then number 3, a counterterrorism strategy has to be about something significantly more than just the kinetic aspect. And the Somalia strategy and the way in which the neighbors and others tried to go beyond just fighting al-Shabaab on the ground, although fighting was an important part of it, and the resources and the governance capacity building that was put into it also matters a lot as well. But fundamentally, the goal in Somalia and in the surrounding countries, in northern Kenya, in Ethiopia, is to think about what once was maybe unthinkable for Somalia, a situation in which increasingly people have the opportunity to live up to their potential in a stable and secure state and situation. And where the United States and the other countries that are working on this see less of a threat emanating out of that region, out of the instability in that region. And I think that's what we're trying to drive for. But I don't want to call Somalia an outright success story by any stretch, but I want to call it a story of progress from which we can learn valuable lessons that we can apply in other places as well.
So it remains for me to observe just how fortunate the country is to have, and the administration is to have someone of your caliber working on their behalf. Duke is fortunate that you squeezed us in before you head back out. I'm not sure everyone knows, but you're heading to Geneva tomorrow, right, regardless of the weather.
Yeah,
so,
exactly.
So we wish you well. We want you to be fully equipped and empowered with the maximum leverage possible. And I believe that if you wore this into the meeting, or maybe in the gym at the hotel, you just might get the concessions that you need to seal a deal. So please, I hope you wear that, and I hope you succeed, and please join me in thanking you.
Thank you.